Strategic Test Prep, and I'm joined with one of our amazing tutors, Andy, who just took the March SAT. How's it going, Andy?
Yeah, it's going really well. Overall, I'm pretty pleased, but I'm sure you're gonna have a lot of questions, so we'll get into that.
I definitely do, and I'm sure everybody out there is going to be interested to hear your thoughts. I mean, you're an expert at this test. You do great work with our students, and so the first thing I think we should just get right into it is, what did you think about this test compared to the new blue books? Because I know everybody wants to know, was this test harder than those blue book tests that came out 7 through 10?
Yeah, I definitely noticed some differences, but I do think that the new Blue Book tests are probably the best prep for or at least they were for the March test. So if anyone's watching this later in preparation for May or June, yeah, I think the new Blue Book tests were probably the best representatives of what I saw on the March test today. Module 1 English was like, I noticed some differences. There were just some things that I didn't see on any of the blue books, but overall, I think mostly representative. Math definitely seemed comparable.
So yeah, so just to dive into those differences, I'm curious, the differences, you said module 1 English, was it like in regards to grammar stuff, or was it more like reading passages that were different? What in particular was different, do you think?
Yeah, I remember a reading synthesis question, not a rhetorical synthesis like note taking, just a reading question, like a main idea, main purpose style that just asked the main purpose in a really weird way, but it was still asking for the main purpose.
Okay, so the question stem was weird.
Yeah.
Got
And
it.
I saw for grammar, I saw a lot more of I think it's called the infinitive, to blank, than I had in any of the real tests in 23 or 24 or some of the blue books.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I feel like the trend that I've seen, it has been the gerund being right, the ing verb, but you're saying that the infinite form was actually on there, like to run, to jump.
Yeah.
That's
And
so interesting.
obviously we can't go into specifics. We can't
Right.
discuss any exact questions, but the infinitive was on there, and sometimes I think the right answer and sometimes not.
Okay, very good. All right, so the next question I have for you is also in regards to difficulty. Sometimes the test presents lopsided. So to give you an example, in March of last year, 2024, the students lamented about how difficult the math modules were, and then the English was pretty simple. And then on the flip side, October of 2024, all the students were complaining that the English was terribly hard and the math was pretty reasonable. In your experience today, did one half of the test feel more difficult than the other?
I would say the English was probably a little harder than expected overall, both module 1 and 2. Module 1, I don't know if it was harder so much as there were differences, and like we talked about, and questions that I wasn't used to seeing phrased that way, which kind of threw me off a little bit. And to folks who are really well prepared by really intensely studying like the blue book tests exactly as they appear, might have been thrown off. But module 2, there were definitely, most of module 2 I would say was about what I expected, maybe a touch harder, or I just feel that way because I can't see what the right answer is like I do after taking the blue books.
Got it. Yeah. I think that that's the one thing, not to be a negative Nancy, that is limiting about prepping with the blue book tests, is sometimes there are those curveballs that come outside of what we've prepared for, right?
Yeah.
And they could be experimental, right? I mean, they throw out 2 questions on every module, so we don't know for sure if those questions count. But that's why I love that we always have a tutor on our team go in and take the test, because, and I think that's why we're so good at this and why we help so many students succeed. We are keeping an eye on the moving target. Whereas not to throw shade at other tutors out there, other companies, but if you're not sitting in on these tests, it's hard to keep an eye on what's going on and what's trending and what kind of new questions they're asking. I mean, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. It was an incredibly informative experience for me taking that test. I had not taken an SAT since my SAT back when I was in high school. And so I had not taken the digital SAT. So I took all of Bluebook's 7 through 10 in advance in the week or two leading up to the test, just as the best possible practice.
Yeah, and wait, hang on.
It just felt a little different.
Can we talk about that for a second? I don't mean to cut you off, but guys, Andy was getting ready for this test and he sent me a text. Bluebook 7, he got a 1600. Bluebook 8, he got a 1580 because he just missed one logically completes the text. Bluebook 9, he got a 1600. Bluebook 10, he got a 1600. I mean, this is probably one of the most impressive score reports I've seen from a tutor because, you know, you haven't seen these tests. They were brand new. They were just released. So where do you think your score is going to fall on this test? Do you think you'll be at a 1600 or what would you estimate?
Yeah, I felt pretty good coming out of it. I thought, you know, I feel like I have a good chance at getting a 1600. And then the more I thought about it, I was like, oh, but what if they got me on this question that I kind of remember? This was phrased a little funny. What if they got me there? And then I start thinking that in other situations. And by the end of this call, I'm probably going to think I got like a 450. But I do feel very good overall.
Good. Well, I'm really curious to know, I mean, we came out with this new gangbusters strategy where you can read the last sentence on a lot of the reading passages, particularly in that first block of reading from like number 6 to 10. And that's typically where the right answer lies. In your experience today in this test, did you find that to be the case? Because I noticed on some of the new released blue books, that strategy didn't hold weight all the time.
Yeah, I specifically remember a test from Bluebook 7, I think, maybe 8, about the, I think it was the blueback salmon, the log jams and the blueback salmon. And the last sentence was an example of the main idea instead of actually the main idea. So I actually specifically kept an eye out for that when I was doing the main idea, main purpose problems. And for the most part, I think that last sentence strategy did still hold up. There was one overall structure of the text question where I think you probably could have done it by reading the first and last sentence and comparing to the first and last part of each 3-part answer option. And you maybe could have done it with just the last, but it was really the middle that stood out as the biggest difference.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, and that's one thing that's so nuancey about those overall structure of text is each part of the answer choice corresponds with a different sentence in the passage. So the first part of the answer choice corresponds with the first sentence. So if you guys are out there watching this and you weren't aware of that, that's a way you can shortcut those overall structure of text questions. Like if Andy's saying the middle of the passage stood out, then you want to look to the middle of the 3 things listed in the answer choices and make sure that those match up.
It didn't stand out for me until I read the last sentence, compared it to the last part of each answer option, felt a little uncertain about some eliminations. So I went up, read the first sentence, still felt a little uncertain, read the middle, then it really stood out. But I mean, that strategy will save you time on average because a lot of them, you can just read the last sentence and then the last part of each answer option. So if you run into a question where you actually do have to read the whole thing, well, you know, that's one question out of a few, and it'll save you time overall still, as opposed to approaching every overall structure problem by reading everything every time.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what, you know, like, I feel like, you know, taking the test is a game, right? Like, and I love that aspect of it because I feel like we've gotten really good at playing the game and just knowing the different types of questions and what to look for.
Oh, yeah. I caught a lot of traps that they set on this one. I think overall, probably the ones with the most subtle traps are probably more likely to be the 2 that get thrown out. But there were definitely some traps that students who know our methods probably recognized as well.
Yeah, interesting. Do you want to get into detail about any of the traps without speaking on specific questions? Like, give me a general sense of some of the traps you saw.
There was a problem with a line of best fit, but it wasn't linear. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but the y-intercept of an exponential graph gets affected by both what's being multiplied in front of the base and what's being added afterwards. So in the sort of a times b to the x plus c general formula for an exponential, the multiplication by a, the y-intercept is actually a plus c, not just the c.
Which is so interesting. And I feel like that's a case where Desmos is like super important to be able to see, because that's not a function we're familiar with. We are familiar with more linear stuff, or even quadratics, where we know if we add to y, it'll shift it up, right? But in a case like that, that's so interesting how there are a couple factors of the function that can contribute to where the y-intercept is at. I love Desmos for that. How much do you think you use Desmos on this test?
I use Desmos on every question that I possibly could. It is, Desmos is broken. It is incredibly powerful for, even if you don't use it to get your answer, use it to check your answer. I went through all of module 1, doing everything manually where I could, and then I went back and did the entire thing again with Desmos, just checking my answers. And then, of course, there were some problems where it just didn't make sense at all to do by hand. Why would you when you can use Desmos? So I did that, and that was how I caught that question with the y-intercept. I put all the equations into Desmos, compared them, and it was there was, I don't want to get into too much specific, of course. But there was
I know it's hard.
About the correct graph that stood out that was different from the graph that you might think at first glance is the right answer.
Now, here's another thing that I'm wondering about. You know, I've gotten some text messages from my students so far, and I'm happy to say I've heard that some of my predictions came true. Oh, yeah. One of which I won't get into specifics about what the question was, I pulled from a new Bluebook test, which I know has been very controversial lately. You know, one of my colleagues who I deeply respect had mentioned that I'm spoiling the Bluebooks, and I'm definitely taking that into consideration, where I think in the future I might put up something on the screen that says, hey, this is a Bluebook test question. But I've noticed that sometimes when I use Bluebook questions, they end up showing up. My predictions do come true. So I don't want to not use Bluebook questions. So one of them came true. It was a factoring question. But Andy, like overall, do you see that there's a lot of alignment with the Bluebook math concepts and then the math concepts on the real test? Or were there a lot of crazy things that weren't on the Bluebooks?
There were a ton of questions that I recognized from Bluebook 7 through 10, and some of the tests that we work through with our students at Strategic Test Prep. I noticed that weren't Bluebooks, but yes, on the Bluebook specifically, absolutely, it was all over the place. Fingerprints everywhere, same questions, exactly the same question, just with different numbers used.
That's what I heard. That's what I heard. And that actually happened last year. I know like Bluebook released test 5 and 6, and I showed all the kids on my channel how to do a nonlinear regression. I pulled one of the problems from Bluebook. I said, hey, I think this is going to be on the June test. It was on the June test. Like almost verbatim, they just changed some numbers in the table, and they just changed some numbers in and I sat in on that test. So that's good to hear, because I think that when the new digital SAT rolled out, honestly, College Board was getting some bad PR, because a lot of the international students at the time that were taking the new variation were saying that the practice tests and the real tests weren't lining up. But it feels like things are starting to smooth out.
Yeah, absolutely. They said Bluebooks 1 through 3 seemed on the easier side, not very representative. And when they released the new Bluebooks 7 through 10, they reused a lot of questions from 1 through 3, but I think they reused the most representative ones and added more that are also representative of what we really encounter on the digital SAT. So it definitely felt like those were the best possible practice.
That makes me happy to hear.
Mhm.
I have to ask you this. So if you were, now that you've seen the test, if you were to recommend one thing to your students to focus on or study, what would it be?
Yeah, so for the English section, I would say probably just knowing your comma splice inside and out.
Okay.
Knowing that even when you select an answer that doesn't have a comma in it, it might cause the rest of the text to fail a comma splice. There was a really dense question where, looking at it first glance, you would think that it was one punctuation mark, but that if you read carefully and like crossed out the non-essential information, got rid of the fluff, you could tell that it actually, the reverse of what we normally see, it did not have a complete sentence after a comma, after the punctuation. So comma is the right choice in that sort of situation.
Yes,
Mhm.
interesting. I know. And it's cool too with the strategies because I feel like sometimes I almost can anticipate what the right answer is on crazy ones, crazy grammar ones like that, because I've noticed sometimes they'll give an answer choice that has a comma with an and then a semicolon, and then a period, and then there's only one answer with a comma. And it's like, we all know a comma with a fanboys that can separate
Mhm.
two independent clauses. So can a semicolon, so can a period. So I love those situations where you can just quickly cross the 3 off and you know it has to be the comma
Mhm.
without even doing any reading.
Yeah,
Um,
comma which is another good one to know.
mhm.
Um, comma which, then that is okay to have like which as a pseudo subject and an action happening after that.
Yeah. Okay, so here's another question. With staying vague, right, not getting too specific, was there anything concept-wise that showed up that was new on this test that you hadn't seen before?
Yeah, there was I think we already talked about the infinitive to blank, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, that was something that I just hadn't seen much of on any of the blue books, at least.
What about the math? Anything new on the math?
I did see a triangle inequality theorem problem. I think it was at
Oh,
the end of
okay.
module 1, at least on my version. That is something that I didn't see on any of the blue book tests. I haven't seen on any of the tests we've worked on with our students,
Hmm.
but it's one of those things that I'm aware comes up every so often on the SAT. Radians to degrees and degrees to radians is another
Mm,
one, and
hmm.
coterminal angles, where you can add 360 or add 2 pi to an angle and it's the same angle.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I've seen that before too. And I think that students have a tough time recognizing that every 2 pi is one rotation about the unit circle. So
Mhm.
it's like if you do 4 pi rotations, you're basically back to 0 or
Mhm.
360, however you want to look at
Yeah.
it, you're back to the start. So yeah, I feel like geometry is that one category where they have so much leeway to play with different types of
Mhm.
questions. But I
Different little
also,
obscure things that come up really briefly in
mhm.
geometry, and then you forget about them by the time you're in calculus.
Exactly. And that's why I swear, I think like the majority of the students that come to us and I have consultations with, and we sit down and we look at their score report, Andy, they are weaker in geometry and
Mhm.
trigonometry and problem solving and data analysis. Why? Because with geometry, it's theorems that you need to remember from way back when. With problem solving data analysis, it's statistics stuff that you need to remember from way back when. So it's like if you don't use it, you
Mhm.
lose it. But the good news is I feel like the concepts that they test in those areas are narrow enough where I think it's very easy to bring a student up to speed,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
Yeah.
There's
Um,
there's several usual culprits.
And that's why I'm so excited that we're reworking our math workbook this year. I mean, you're helping with that. I think
Yes.
you are doing the geometry and trig unit.
I am, yeah. I actually, before I moved into specifically test prep tutoring, I did a lot of subject tutoring, and I still do that. I still do subject tutoring specifically, but I did tend to notice that it was way more common out of any of the other subjects for geometry to be kind of the odd one out, that some people do much better in and some people struggle much more in. It's just, I attribute it to, it's a different kind of information you have to hold in your brain, like visual information as opposed to numerical information.
Right.
So that's pretty common, but usually all it takes is just a quick refresher course.
Yeah, totally. So as far as, our execution strategies, not to jump back to English, but I'm going to jump back to English.
Yeah.
We have different approaches that we recommend to our students. And I know I've been a big advocate of hey, start at number 27 and work backwards and skip that block of, number 14 to 12 or to 11 or 15 to 11, depending on where the reading passages start, because those are the hardest ones. But we have other ones too. We have start at the beginning and then, do the first block of reading and skip the other block of reading and then go to the end, or jump to 15 and start with the grammar. What execution strategy did you personally use today on the test?
You mentioned it, actually, the second one you mentioned. I started at the beginning and then I worked through the first half of the reading questions, skipped the inferences, and came back at the end just to make sure I had enough time to get to all of the easy problems, the easier problems, like the note-taking questions. You want to make sure you get to those. So yeah, I started with the vocab because I like to, in case the vocab words are a little obscure, I like to just give a first glance at them and kind of let my mind stew over it. If I have to skip it and come back, then maybe I'll recognize it the second go around.
Nice. All right. This is just a minor obsession of mine because I find that there's no standardization amongst test centers about how much scrap paper students are given. Some students I talked to, they say they got 1. Other students I talked to, they said, oh, they gave us 3. How many pieces of scrap paper did you get with your center today to start?
Yeah, we got 1 piece of scrap paper. It was graph paper.
Oh, they gave you graph paper.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Did you end up having to ask for any more scrap paper during the test?
I did not. No, I write small and I did most of everything on Desmos, so I didn't need the scrap paper as much.
Got it. Okay. Okay. So that's an easy question, right? That was quick. I'm just curious. Oh, speaking of centers, did everything go smoothly at your test center? Because unfortunately, some of my students had a disastrous situation today.
Really? No, I didn't hear anything about that.
Yeah, so a couple of my students took the test at a center where they had them log out of bluebook in the middle of the test. So they were actually on their 10-minute break, and the proctors had gotten an email from College Board allegedly about there being a potential hacking situation. Anyways, I guess College Board had advised everyone to log back out and log back in, but this was before the test started. The proctors never saw the email. So they had my students log out of the test in the middle of the test, and my students couldn't log back in. And so they ended up losing like 13 minutes on the first math module.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So they essentially all ended up getting the easy second module, as you can imagine, right? Because they didn't have enough time to do the first math module. So I'm hoping that their test scores, they can cancel their test scores. I'm hoping that they'll offer them a retake because it wasn't their fault. It was the proctors. But then funny thing, I'm getting messages on YouTube today. I guess there was a glitch in Asia too.
Jeez.
So in Asia, some of the students automatically got logged out. It shut them down. Leah, it shut down for you too? Okay, some people in the chat are saying that this happened to them. So I think that in Asia, there's going to be a retake in a couple of weeks. My heart goes out to students that really, they get up early, they get to the center, they've done so much work to prepare, and then something like this happens, it's like it's just a kind of a inconvenient annoyance, right? When you're all ready to go. But I'm just telling everyone, hey, listen, this is just a minor bump in the road. You still have the tools, you still have the skills. If you take the retake in a couple weeks, you'll do great. It's just sometimes these like hiccups happen and there's nothing that you can do about it. Did you hear any things from any of your students, Andy, or does it seem like everything was copacetic with your students?
No, a good vocab word. Yeah, I texted all my students, and nobody mentioned anything like that.
Okay,
So
that's good. That's
pretty
good to hear.
limited in scope.
Yeah, that's good. I think sometimes too, students freak out when they don't get their score back right away. So for everybody out there listening where the test went fine, they will withhold some scores. I believe they withhold like 10% of scores for an extra week. Don't quote me on this. I just know that it's happened. It's like to just check on the validity of the test. So if you end up not getting your score back on March 23rd, don't panic. It will come to you. It'll probably just arrive like a week later. You're just one of the unlucky small subset of students that they're holding. Okay. All right. So the next thing is, what would you say? So like, let's say, there's obviously, I'm sure some students out there that are feeling like the test just did not go well for them today. What would you say, Andy, to students out there where they just are feeling a little discouraged right now, like the test didn't go well?
Yeah, the SAT, it should never be the plan to take it once and be completely done with it. You get the best experience of taking the SAT by taking the SAT. So you should always think of your first round as the practice round, and maybe more practice rounds even after that. I would even think of everything as your practice round. And then one of those practices, you might get a score that you're really proud of. And then I guess that wasn't the practice, that was the real thing.
Yeah, I think that that's really good advice. I agree. I think, for lots of reasons, super scoring, getting the jitters out, all of that stuff, like taking more than one test is super important. I agree. Sometimes people will call us and they're like, I just want to get this over with. And, I just want the March just to be a one and done and just do the March. And to be honest, like one and dones are unicorns, especially if you're aiming for like a high score over a 1500. It takes some work, it takes some dedication, and typically, not always, but typically it's going to take 2 to 3 tests.
Yeah.
So
there's some luck involved too. I mean, every test is different. Otherwise it would be too predictable. So there's going to be things that you're stronger in that show up less on some tests. And if you go back, you might get a new test on your next attempt that has a lot more of what you feel like are your strengths.
Yeah, that's true. So you're obviously an adult, right? We send adults in to take this test. I've done it a couple times now myself since it went to the digital. Did you get any weird looks or side eyes from students today at the test center?
I definitely saw people looking at me. I considered wearing a hat to hide bright light warning. Everybody got your sunglasses ready? That. But then I worried like they might tell me to remove my hat in case I wrote like answers on the brim or something. And then it would be probably more embarrassing and draw more attention if it was obvious that I was trying to hide it, as if I just wore it proudly. So yeah, I got a few weird looks, no comments, but I think people these days kind of get that everyone's got a situation that you don't really know about, and maybe there's someone who is trying to go to college late in life, and that's really admirable. So
that's so true too. Like I actually just had a call this past week from someone who's in the military, and they want to go back to school after the military, and so they needed an SAT score. So yeah, you're right. You never know. Okay, so as a test prep coach who has now taken an official test, what is something that you know now, having this experience today, that you didn't know before that you could share with your students?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Something I know now that I didn't know before. Time moves differently when you're taking a practice as opposed to when you're taking like a blue book as to when you're taking the real test. It just feels like every question takes a little bit longer. So your timing that you get on your practice might not be exactly how it feels on the real test. And I think maybe it was because when I was taking the practices, I was at home with no distractions. And when I'm in the actual test, there's people like cracking a knuckle. And that just, that 1 second that you lose every now and then from your brain getting momentarily distracted by something that's happening over there can just kind of build up. I think that might be the best way I can describe that. So yeah, time moves a little differently on practice than the real thing. So try your best to be at a space you're comfortable in with a minute or two left in practice to feel more comfortable with the timing that you have in the real test.
Yeah, and I'm going to add to that right now, because there's actually YouTube videos out there. You can like search on YouTube, guys. You can get videos that get like have sounds in a test taking room. So if you play the video while you're doing your practice, you can hear the coughs, you can hear the papers rustling. Like it's just like the normal distracting sounds that you would hear in the test. And sometimes I'll recommend that to my students who tell me they have a tough time focusing, because if you can practice and replicate the actual conditions as much as possible, it'll make you more prepared in the test.
That's actually great advice. I wish
Yeah. All right, awesome. Okay, so we're almost done. Thanks, Sandy, for doing this. I have just a few quick questions, so just give me like a 1 or 2 word answer for these. We're going to do a lightning round. Are you ready?
Sure, yeah.
All right, I asked these to all the tutors, so here we go. So do you hide the clock or show the clock?
Show.
How much scrap paper did you use?
Half a page.
Half a page. Do you use a pen or a pencil?
Pen.
Do you prefer an iPad, laptop, or Chromebook?
Laptop.
And what % of the questions do you think you use Desmos on for the math?
10% first go, 90% second go.
Nice. Awesome. All right. Well, that's it. That's all the questions I have for you. Thanks so much for sharing your insights and your experience with us and for taking the test today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks everybody out there for watching. I hope you had a good experience today. And until next time, guys, happy prepping.
Yeah.